Hey guys, so imagine this for a second. You're sitting here, probably watching this on your phone or laptop. Maybe it's evening, and you've got your room lights on, maybe some LED strips for that cozy vibe. Now imagine I told you to turn off every single light in your house. No phone screen, no street lights outside, no digital clock glowing in the corner, just darkness. Pure, absolute darkness the moment the sun goes down. That was life for literally 99.9% of human history. And honestly, it's kind of wild when you think about it. We've only had electric lighting for what, like 150 years. Before that, when night fell, the world just stopped. Or did it? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating questions about pre-electric life. How did people actually survive those long, dark nights? And I'm not just talking about survival in the don't get eaten by wolves sense, though, yeah, that was definitely a concern. I'm talking about the entire social, economic, and cultural ecosystem that revolved around darkness. So grab something warm to drink, maybe dim your lights a bit to get in the mood, but don't turn them off completely because you still need to see this. And let's journey back to a world where sunset wasn't just the end of the day. It was the beginning of an entirely different universe. Before we dive in though, quick favor, if you're enjoying this deep dive into pre-electric life, hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel, and it lets me know you want more of these longer, more detailed explorations of historical daily life. And honestly, the algorithm seems to think you guys prefer 10-minute videos about TikTok drama, so prove it wrong, yeah? Now, here's what you're probably picturing when I say life before electric lights. You're imagining some medieval peasant family huddled around a fireplace, maybe reading by candlelight, going to bed at like 8 p.m, because what else is there to do, right? Wrong. So wonderfully, fascinatingly wrong. The reality is that pre-electric nightlife was incredibly complex, varied, and in many cases, more socially active than our modern evenings. Different cultures, different time periods, different social classes, they all had completely unique relationships with darkness. And some of these solutions were absolutely brilliant, while others were, well, let's just say they involved a lot more fire hazards than modern safety regulations would appreciate. Let's start with the obvious question, what did people actually use for light? Because contrary to what movies show us, it wasn't just fireplace and maybe a candle if you're fancy. The history of artificial lighting is basically the history of human ingenuity trying to push back against the dark. The earliest artificial lights were basically controlled fires. We're talking about oil lamps that date back to like 70,000 BCE. Picture this, you're a prehistoric human, you've figured out fire, and now you're thinking, okay, but what if I could make this fire portable? So you get a shell or a hollowed out stone, you fill it with animal fat or oil, stick a wick made of plant fiber or twisted animal hair in there, and boom. You've just invented the oil lamp. These weren't exactly bright. We're talking about the light equivalent of maybe a single birthday candle. But in a world of complete darkness, that tiny flame was revolutionary. It meant you could extend your day. You could work on tools, tell stories, keep watch for predators. You could have what anthropologists call the second day, those precious hours after sunset, when life didn't just stop. But here's where it gets interesting. Different cultures developed wildly different lighting technologies based on what resources they had available. In ancient Egypt, they were using oil lamps fueled by castor oil or olive oil. The wealthy could afford beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter but cost a fortune. We're talking about candles that were literally worth more than most people's monthly wages. The Romans, they went absolutely crazy with oil lamps. Archaeological sites have uncovered thousands of these things, decorated with everything from gladiator scenes to, let's call them, adult entertainment motifs. Because apparently, even in ancient Rome, people wanted their lighting to have personality. In medieval Europe, most people relied on rushlights, basically reeds soaked in animal fat. They were cheap, easy to make, and provided just enough light to not walk into furniture. The downside: they smelled absolutely terrible. Imagine the scent of burning fat mixed with whatever the animal had been eating, all concentrated in your living space for hours. Romantic, right? But the real game changer was the candle. Not just any candle, beeswax candles. These were the luxury cars of medieval lighting. They burned clean, smelled pleasant, and gave off significantly more light than oil lamps or rushlights. But they were so expensive that most people only saw them in churches or wealthy households. The Catholic Church actually became one of the biggest consumers of candles in medieval Europe. Think about it, they needed light for evening services, late night prayers, and all those dramatic religious ceremonies. Some cathedrals would burn through hundreds of pounds of beeswax every month. That's like the equivalent of burning money, literally. And then there were the really creative solutions. In areas where whales were hunted, people used whale oil, which burned incredibly bright and clean. Native American tribes in certain regions used fish oil, particularly from oily fish like salmon. In parts of Asia, people developed elaborate systems using multiple oil lamps with polished metal reflectors to amplify the light. But here's the thing that movies never show you. All of these lighting methods were dangerous. Like, seriously dangerous. House fires were incredibly common. Oil lamps could tip over. Candles could ignite curtains or clothing. Rushlights could fall out of their holders. People literally lived with the constant risk that their attempt to light the darkness might burn their entire house down. There are records from medieval London showing that house fires were so common, they had specific laws about candle use. You couldn't leave a candle burning unattended. You had to use proper holders. Some areas even had candle curfews, where certain types of lighting were banned after specific hours. And the cost! Oh man, the cost. For most people, artificial lighting was a luxury they could barely afford. A single candle might represent several hours of wages. Oil for lamps was expensive. Even the cheapest rushlights required animal fat, which was also used for cooking and soap making. So what did this mean for daily life? It meant that most people's relationship with light was completely different from ours. Light was precious. It was finite. It was something you planned around, budgeted for, and used strategically. Wealthy households might have enough candles or oil to light multiple rooms for several hours each evening. But for most people, you got maybe one small light source, and you used it carefully. Families would gather around a single oil lamp or candle to maximize its benefit. Everything eating, talking, working, playing happened in that small circle of light. This is where the social aspect gets really fascinating. Because when you only have one light source, everyone has to be in the same place. There's no wandering off to different rooms to do different activities. The family unit becomes incredibly tight, knit by necessity. But it wasn't just about families. Entire communities developed social structures around shared lighting. In many villages, people would gather in one house that could afford better lighting. They'd share the cost of oil or candles, and in return, everyone would contribute something: food, stories, labor, entertainment. These weren't just practical arrangements. They were the foundation of community culture. Some of the greatest oral traditions in human history developed around these shared evening gatherings. Epic poems, folk tales, songs, jokes, they were all passed down during these communal light-sharing sessions. And here's something that'll blow your mind. People's sleep patterns were completely different. We think of sleep as this 8-hour block, right? You go to bed, you sleep through the night, you wake up. But before electric lighting, most people practiced what historians call segmented sleep, or first and second sleep. Here's how it worked. People would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for about 4 hours, then wake up naturally around midnight. They'd stay awake for 1 to 3 hours talking, praying, having sex, doing light household tasks, or just lying in bed thinking. Then they'd go back to sleep until dawn. This wasn't insomnia. This was normal. There are references to first and second sleep in literature, court documents, medical texts, and personal diaries from all across Europe, and many other cultures. People planned their lives around this pattern. And what did they do during those midnight waking hours? Well, that's where things get really interesting. So let's talk about what people actually did during those long, dark hours. Because the assumption that everyone just went to bed at sunset and slept until dawn. That's basically a myth created by modern people who can't imagine life without Netflix. The reality was that darkness brought its own rhythm of activities, many of which were impossible or impractical during daylight hours. And I'm not just talking about the obvious stuff like romance, though yeah, that was definitely a major nighttime activity when you consider that most people lived in single-room houses with their entire families. Let's start with work. You heard that right, work. Certain types of labor were actually better suited to evening hours. Take bread baking, for example. Bakers would often start their work in the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 a.m., so that fresh bread would be ready when the market opened at dawn. The ovens provided warmth during cold nights, and the timing meant they could sell their products at peak demand. Blacksmiths sometimes worked evening shifts too, especially during summer months, when working next to a blazing forge during the heat of the day was basically torture. The forge provided its own light, and the cooler evening air made the work more bearable. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Entire industries developed around nighttime work. Night soil men, basically human waste collectors, did their work under cover of darkness for obvious reasons. They'd go from house to house, collecting waste from private latrines and cesspits, then transport it outside the city walls. It was smelly, disgusting work, but it was essential for public health, and doing it at night meant fewer complaints from residents. Watchmen patrolled cities and towns throughout the night, calling out the hours and keeping an eye out for fires, thieves, or other dangers. These guys were basically the original night shift workers. They'd carry lanterns and walk predetermined routes, shouting things like, 2 o'clock and all is well. Their calls served as both time announcements and reassurance that someone was keeping watch. And then there were the really specialized night workers. Lamplighters in cities that had public lighting would start their work at dusk, going from lamp to lamp with their ladders and oil supplies. Link boys, usually young men or boys, would carry torches to light the way for wealthy people traveling through dark city streets. It was like an early version of Uber, except with more fire hazards and probably worse customer ratings. But work wasn't the only thing happening after dark. Social life continued, just in different forms. Taverns and inns remained open well into the evening, serving as community gathering places. These weren't just places to drink, they were information exchanges, entertainment venues, and social clubs all rolled into one. Picture this, you're a medieval craftsman, you've finished your work for the day, and you head to the local tavern. It's lit by a few oil lamps and maybe a fireplace, creating this warm, flickering atmosphere. People are sharing news from other towns, telling stories, playing dice games, singing songs. Someone might have a lute or other instrument. The tavern keeper is serving ale, wine, or whatever local alcoholic beverage is available. These gatherings weren't just fun, they were essential for community cohesion. This is where people learned about job opportunities, arranged marriages, settled disputes, and shared important information. In a world without newspapers, television, or internet, the evening tavern session was basically social media, news broadcast, and entertainment all in one. Religious activities also intensified after dark. Many Christian monasteries held services throughout the night, matins at midnight, lauds at 3 a.m., prime at sunrise. Monks would wake up multiple times during the night to pray, sing, and read religious texts. This wasn't seen as disruptive to sleep. It was seen as the proper way to honor God around the clock. For lay people, evening prayers were a standard part of daily routine. Families would gather around their single light source to recite prayers, read from religious texts if they were literate, or listen to religious stories. This served multiple purposes: spiritual devotion, family bonding, and education all at once. But let's be honest, not all nighttime activities were wholesome. Cities after dark could be dangerous places. With limited lighting and fewer people around, criminals had plenty of opportunities for theft, assault, and other illegal activities. Many cities implemented curfews, requiring people to be indoors after a certain hour unless they had specific business. The phrase, and cry, comes from medieval night watch systems. If someone witnessed a crime or was being attacked, they would literally shout and cry. And everyone within hearing distance was legally obligated to help pursue the criminal. It was like a community-based emergency response system. Prostitution flourished in the evening hours, often in specific districts or establishments that everyone knew about but didn't officially acknowledge. These areas provided their own lighting and security, creating little pockets of nighttime economy that operated parallel to daytime society. And then there were the seasonal variations. Summer nights were completely different from winter nights. In summer, people could stay outside later, work in gardens by moonlight, hold festivals and celebrations that extended well past sunset. The longer daylight hours meant that night started later and ended earlier. But winter was a different beast entirely. In northern climates, darkness could last 16 hours or more. People had to be incredibly strategic about light use, fuel consumption, and indoor activities. This is when storytelling really flourished. Long, elaborate tales that could fill hours of darkness. Epic poems like Beowulf or the Iliad weren't just literature. They were evening entertainment that could last for multiple nights. Families would engage in crafts that didn't require precise vision, spinning thread, repairing tools, preparing food for the next day. Women would often do needlework by whatever light was available, creating the intricate embroidery and textiles that we admire in museums today. Children had their own nighttime routines. They'd listen to stories, learn songs and rhymes, play simple games that didn't require much light. This is where so many traditional children's games and songs originated. They were designed to be played in low light conditions. And here's something that might surprise you. People were generally much more aware of natural light cycles. They could tell time by the position of stars, the phase of the moon, the quality of darkness. A cloudy night felt completely different from a clear night with a full moon. People planned activities around lunar cycles, saving outdoor work for brighter nights and indoor activities for darker ones. The moon was basically a free public lighting system. Full moon nights were like having a natural street lamp, and people took advantage of it. Markets might stay open later, social gatherings could extend into the evening, and travel was much safer. There's a reason why so many festivals and celebrations were scheduled around full moons. It wasn't just mystical or religious, it was practical. But what about the psychological aspects of all this darkness? How did people cope with spending so much time in low light conditions? Well, first off, their eyes were adapted to it in ways that ours aren't. When you live most of your life in relatively dim conditions, your night vision becomes significantly better. People could navigate familiar spaces in almost complete darkness, relying on memory, touch, and whatever minimal light was available. But there were definitely psychological challenges. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't a recognized condition, but the symptoms were real. People in northern climates often experienced what they called winter melancholy, depression, lethargy, and social withdrawal during the darkest months. Different cultures developed different coping mechanisms. Some emphasized community gatherings during the darkest periods. Others focused on indoor crafts and creative activities. Many cultures had winter festivals specifically designed to combat the psychological effects of extended darkness. Think Christmas, Hanukkah, Diwali, or the Roman Saturnalia. These weren't just religious observances, they were community mental health interventions. The wealthy, of course, had more options. They could afford more and better lighting, larger fires, more elaborate entertainment. Wealthy households might host evening salons, dinner parties, or musical performances that lasted well into the night. They could afford to heat multiple rooms, provide lighting for various activities, and essentially create their own little bubbles of extended daytime. But even the wealthy were constrained by the fundamental realities of pre-electric lighting. No matter how many candles you could afford, you still couldn't replicate the brightness and convenience of electric lighting. Even the most luxurious medieval castle was still pretty dim by our standards. This brings us to one of the most interesting aspects of pre-electric nightlife, the development of what historians call night culture. This was a parallel social world that operated according to different rules and norms than daytime society. Night culture had its own economy, its own social hierarchies, its own forms of entertainment and interaction. People who were marginal figures during the day, street performers, fortune tellers, small-time merchants, might become central figures in the evening social scene. There were night markets in many cities, especially in warmer climates. These operated by lamplight and torchlight, selling everything from food to crafts to services. The atmosphere was completely different from daytime markets, more intimate, more mysterious, often more dangerous, but also more exciting. Musicians and storytellers found their audiences in the evening hours. Professional entertainers would travel from tavern to tavern, house to house, sharing news, songs, and stories in exchange for food, drink, and a place to sleep. These people were like walking libraries, carrying oral traditions from place to place. And let's not forget about romance. Evening hours provided privacy and intimacy that was often impossible during busy daytime hours. Courtship rituals, secret meetings, romantic encounters, all of these flourished in the relative privacy of darkness. But courtship in the pre-electric era was also heavily regulated by social norms and practical considerations. Young people couldn't just go out on dates the way we think of them. Instead, romantic interactions were often embedded within community activities, evening gatherings, religious festivals, seasonal celebrations. There was a practice in some parts of Europe called bundling, where young couples would spend the evening together in bed, fully clothed and often with a wooden board between them, talking and getting to know each other under the supervision of the girl's family. It sounds bizarre to us, but it made perfect sense in a world where privacy was rare and heating was expensive. The darkness also created opportunities for social transgression. People could move through communities more anonymously, engage in activities that would be scandalous in daylight, or simply escape the social surveillance that characterized daytime life in small communities. This is why so many folk tales and legends are set at night. Darkness was associated with transformation, mystery, danger, and possibility. It was when the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended, when magic could happen, when people could become different versions of themselves. But let's get into the really nitty-gritty details of how different social classes experienced nighttime. Because the difference between rich and poor wasn't just about having more candles. It was about having completely different relationships with darkness itself. For the wealthy, we're talking nobility, successful merchants, high-ranking clergy. Evening could be an extension of daytime luxury. They had the resources to create elaborate lighting displays, host entertainment, and essentially push back against the darkness through sheer economic force. A wealthy medieval household might use dozens of candles for a single evening's entertainment. They'd have servants whose job was specifically to manage lighting, trimming wicks, replacing candles, cleaning lamp chimneys, maintaining fires. They could afford glass windows that let in more natural light during the day and could be covered with expensive curtains at night. These households often had multiple fireplaces, allowing them to heat and light several rooms simultaneously. They could afford imported oils that burned cleaner and brighter than local alternatives. They had access to the best candle makers who could create long, burning, sweet-smelling products that were as much about status display as illumination. Evening entertainment for the wealthy was elaborate and social. They'd host dinner parties that lasted for hours, with multiple courses served by candlelight. There would be music professional musicians hired for the evening, or skilled amateurs among the guests. Dancing was common, despite the relatively dim lighting. Wealthy households often had libraries, and evening reading was a mark of sophistication and education. They'd have specially designed reading lamps, often with polished metal reflectors to concentrate and amplify the light. Reading by candlelight was actually a skill that required practice. You had to position the light correctly to avoid shadows, while not setting your book on fire. But even the wealthy had to be strategic about light use. Candles and oil were expensive even for them, so they'd concentrate their lighting in specific areas and times. A grand evening entertainment might use a month's worth of lighting budget in a single night. For the middle classes, skilled craftsmen, small merchants, minor officials, evening lighting was more modest, but still significant. They might have enough resources for a few good candles or a well-maintained oil lamp. Their evening activities centered around family and close friends rather than large social gatherings. These households often combined practicality with modest comfort. They'd use their evening light for productive activities, mending clothes, preparing food, teaching children, doing accounts. But they'd also set aside time for entertainment, simple games, storytelling, music if someone in the family could play an instrument. The middle classes were often the most innovative when it came to lighting solutions. They had enough resources to experiment, but not enough to waste, so they developed efficient systems for maximizing light output while minimizing cost. They'd use reflective surfaces, multiple small lamps instead of expensive candles, and carefully planned lighting schedules. For the poor, which was most people, evening lighting was a luxury that had to be carefully rationed. A single rushlight or small oil lamp might be all a family could afford, and it would be used sparingly and strategically. Poor families often went to bed shortly after sunset simply because they couldn't afford to stay awake. When they did use artificial light, it was for essential activities only preparing food, tending to sick family members, emergency repairs. But poverty didn't mean social isolation. Poor communities often developed sharing systems for lighting costs. Neighbors would take turns hosting evening gatherings, pooling resources to afford better lighting for community activities. Extended families might live together partly to share lighting expenses. The poor were also more likely to take advantage of free natural lighting. They'd schedule activities around moon phases, work by firelight when possible, and make use of any available public lighting in towns and cities. And here's something interesting. The poor often had better night vision and navigation skills than the wealthy. When you can't afford much artificial light, you learn to function in low light conditions. Poor people could move through dark spaces, identify objects by touch, and navigate familiar areas with minimal visual cues. This created a kind of parallel expertise. While wealthy people had access to better lighting technology, poor people had better darkness adaptation skills. In emergency situations, fires, attacks, natural disasters, these skills could be life-saving. The seasonal variations were also more extreme for the poor. Wealthy households could maintain consistent lighting levels year-round, but poor families had to drastically adjust their routines based on available resources and daylight hours. Winter was particularly challenging. Not only were the nights longer, but fuel for heating and lighting was more expensive. Poor families often combined heating and lighting by gathering around a single fire that served both purposes. They'd go to bed earlier and wake up later, essentially hibernating through the darkest months. But they also developed remarkable resilience and creativity. Poor communities created elaborate systems of mutual aid, shared resources, and collective activities that helped everyone get through the dark months. These weren't just survival strategies. They were the foundation of strong community bonds that often lasted for generations. Now let's talk about the urban versus rural divide, because city darkness was completely different from country darkness. In cities, even medieval ones, There was usually some level of public lighting. Major streets might have oil lamps or torches maintained by the city government or wealthy merchants. Important buildings, churches, government offices, major inns would often keep lights burning throughout the night. Cities also had more ambient light from private sources. With houses packed closely together, light from windows, doorways, and courtyards would spill into streets and alleys. The cumulative effect was that cities were never completely dark, even on moonless nights. But urban lighting was uneven and unreliable. Main thoroughfares might be reasonably well lit, while side streets and poor neighborhoods remained in complete darkness. The contrast could be jarring. You'd go from a relatively bright commercial district to pitch black residential areas within a few blocks. Cities also had more nighttime activity, which created its own lighting ecosystem. Taverns, brothels, gambling houses, and other evening establishments provided islands of light scattered throughout the urban landscape. Night workers, watchmen, bakers, waste collectors carried their own lighting, creating moving points of illumination. But urban darkness also brought unique dangers. Cities attracted criminals who took advantage of dark alleys and unlit areas. The maze-like layout of medieval cities, with narrow, winding streets, made navigation difficult and escape easy for those with criminal intent. Many cities implemented lighting regulations and curfews to address these problems. Property owners might be required to maintain lights outside their buildings. Certain professions were allowed to work after curfew, but they had to carry identification and proper lighting. Rural areas, on the other hand, experienced darkness in its purest form. Once you left the village center, you were in complete wilderness darkness, no ambient light, no street lamps, no nearby buildings with lit windows. But rural people had advantages too. They were more familiar with natural navigation using stars, moon phases, and landscape features to find their way. They knew their local terrain intimately and could move through familiar areas even in complete darkness. Rural communities also had different social patterns around evening activities. Without the distractions and opportunities of city life, rural evening gatherings were often more intimate and family-centered. Extended families and close neighbors would gather in one house, sharing the cost of lighting and the warmth of companionship. Seasonal work patterns in rural areas were closely tied to natural light cycles. Farmers would adjust their schedules based on daylight availability, working longer hours during summer and shorter hours during winter. Evening activities were often related to agricultural needs, tending animals, preparing for the next day's work, maintaining tools and equipment. But rural areas also had their own forms of evening entertainment. Harvest festivals, barn dances, storytelling sessions, and seasonal celebrations were often more elaborate and community-wide than urban equivalents. When the whole village participated in an evening event, the combined resources could create impressive lighting displays and entertainment. The relationship between rural communities and darkness was also more spiritual and mythological. Without the buffer of urban civilization, rural people felt more connected to the natural world and its cycles. Evening folklore, ghost stories, and supernatural beliefs were often stronger in rural areas. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of pre-electric nightlife, the role of the moon and natural lighting cycles in shaping human activity. The moon wasn't just a pretty thing to look at, it was a crucial piece of infrastructure. A full moon provided enough light for many outdoor activities that would be impossible on dark nights. People planned their lives around lunar cycles in ways that modern urban dwellers can barely imagine. Farmers would schedule certain activities for full moon nights, harvesting crops, moving livestock, traveling to markets. The extra light allowed them to extend their working hours without the expense of artificial lighting. Social activities were also timed around moon phases. Weddings, festivals, and community gatherings were often scheduled for full moon periods when people could travel safely and stay out later. The phrase, "once in a blue moon," comes from this tradition. A blue moon, the second full moon in a calendar month, was rare and therefore a special occasion for celebration. But the moon's influence went beyond just providing light. Different cultures developed elaborate systems of lunar timekeeping and planning. They'd track moon phases to predict weather, plan agricultural activities, and schedule religious observances. The contrast between moonlit nights and dark nights was dramatic. On a clear night with a full moon, you could read, travel, work outdoors, and engage in social activities almost as if it were daytime. But on a cloudy, moonless night, the darkness was so complete that even familiar places became dangerous and disorienting. This created a kind of natural rhythm to community life. Dark nights were for indoor, family-centered activities. Bright nights were for community gatherings, travel, and outdoor work. People's social calendars were essentially determined by astronomical events. Star patterns were also important for navigation and timekeeping. Before mechanical clocks became common, people used star positions to tell time during the night. Certain stars rising or setting indicated specific hours, helping night workers and watchmen keep track of time. The seasonal variation in daylight hours had profound effects on community life and individual psychology. In northern climates, the difference between summer and winter night lengths could be extreme, from 18-hour summer days to 18-hour winter nights. Summer nights were times of celebration and extended activity. The long daylight hours meant that night didn't really begin until quite late, and people could stay active well past what we'd consider normal bedtime. Summer festivals often lasted all night, taking advantage of the brief darkness and early sunrise. But winter was a different story. The long nights required careful planning and resource management. Communities had to balance the need for light and warmth against limited fuel supplies. This is when indoor crafts, storytelling, and family activities became most important. Many cultures developed specific winter traditions designed to cope with the psychological challenges of extended darkness. Light festivals, Christmas, Hanukkah, Diwali, the Roman Saturnalia weren't just religious observances. They were community mental health interventions, using artificial light and social gathering to combat the depression and isolation that could result from long, dark winters. The wealthy could afford to maintain more consistent lighting levels throughout the year, but even they felt the psychological impact of seasonal light changes. Medieval and Renaissance literature is full of references to winter melancholy, spring awakening, and the emotional significance of light and darkness. For most people, the annual cycle of light and darkness was one of the fundamental rhythms of existence. Their bodies, their social lives, their work patterns, and their spiritual practices were all synchronized with these natural cycles in ways that we've completely lost in our electrically lit world. Now, let's dive into some specific examples of how different cultures and time periods developed unique solutions to the challenges of darkness. In ancient Rome, the wealthy developed incredibly sophisticated lighting systems. They had multi-wick oil lamps that could provide significant illumination, elaborate candelabras that could hold dozens of candles, and even primitive forms of street lighting in some areas. Roman dinner parties were famous for their extravagant lighting displays. Wealthy hosts would use hundreds of oil lamps and candles to create a brilliant, flickering atmosphere that impressed guests and demonstrated the host's wealth and sophistication. These parties could last all night with professional entertainers, elaborate food presentations, and social networking that was crucial for political and business success. But Romans also developed practical lighting solutions for everyday use. They mass-produced oil lamps in standardized designs, making artificial lighting more affordable for middle-class households. Roman soldiers used portable oil lamps and torches for night operations, and Roman cities had some of the first organized systems of public lighting. In medieval Islamic cities, lighting technology was often more advanced than in Christian Europe. Islamic scholars and craftsmen developed improved oil lamp designs, better wicks, and cleaner burning fuels. The tradition of Islamic scholarship also meant that many people were reading and writing by lamplight, driving innovation in lighting technology. Islamic cities often had better public lighting than European ones. Major mosques would maintain oil lamps throughout the night, and important streets would have some level of illumination. The Islamic tradition of night prayers also meant that there was more legitimate nighttime activity, which supported a more developed night economy. In China, the wealthy developed elaborate systems of paper lanterns that could provide soft, diffused lighting for large areas. Chinese lantern festivals became major cultural events, with entire cities illuminated by thousands of decorative lanterns. These weren't just celebrations, they were demonstrations of community wealth and organization. Chinese households also used a variety of oil lamps, candles, and torches, but they were particularly innovative in developing reflective systems to amplify light. Polished metal mirrors, white-painted walls, and strategic placement of light sources could significantly increase the effective illumination from a single lamp or candle. In Japan, the development of paper screens and sliding doors created unique opportunities for lighting design. A single oil lamp or candle could illuminate multiple rooms through translucent paper panels, creating a soft, even light that was both practical and aesthetically pleasing. Japanese culture also developed specific aesthetic principles around low light environments. The concept of mono no aware, the beauty of transient things, was often associated with the flickering, temporary nature of flame-based lighting. Evening tea ceremonies, poetry readings, and artistic activities were designed to take advantage of the intimate, contemplative atmosphere created by dim lighting. In northern European countries, where winter nights were extremely long, communities developed elaborate systems of shared lighting and communal activities. The Scandinavian tradition of hygge, cozy, intimate social gathering originated partly as a response to the challenges of long, dark winters. These communities would pool resources to maintain communal fires and lighting in central gathering places. Entire villages might gather in a single large room for evening activities, sharing the cost of fuel and light while building strong social bonds that helped everyone survive the psychological challenges of extended darkness. In tropical regions, where the length of night was more consistent year-round, different patterns emerged. Evening activities could be more predictable and regular. Night markets, outdoor social gatherings, and evening work patterns were more stable because communities didn't have to adjust for dramatic seasonal variations. But tropical regions also had unique challenges. High humidity could make oil lamps and candles burn poorly. Insects were attracted to lights, making evening activities uncomfortable. Heavy rains could extinguish outdoor lighting and make travel dangerous. Different tropical cultures developed solutions like covered oil lamps, insect-repelling fuel additives, and architectural designs that protected lighting from weather while allowing for ventilation. The development of trade routes also influenced lighting technology and culture. Merchants traveling between regions would encounter different lighting solutions and bring innovations back to their home communities. The Silk Road, Mediterranean trade networks, and other commercial connections helped spread lighting technology and evening cultural practices across vast distances. For example, the use of whale oil for lighting spread from whaling communities to inland areas through trade networks. Beeswax candles, which were initially produced mainly in areas where beekeeping was common, became luxury items traded across continents. Different types of oil lamps, wick designs, and fuel sources spread through commercial networks, creating a kind of global exchange of lighting technology. But trade also created new challenges for nighttime activities. Merchants traveling long distances had to carry their own lighting supplies, plan routes around available fuel sources, and navigate unfamiliar terrain in darkness. Caravanserais, roadside inns for traveling merchants, became crucial infrastructure, providing not just shelter and food, but also reliable lighting and security for nighttime stops. Pirates and bandits took advantage of the limited lighting available to travelers, attacking caravans and ships under cover of darkness. This led to the development of convoy systems, armed escorts, and strategic timing of travel to take advantage of moon phases and avoid the darkest nights. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you: the role of women in managing household lighting and evening activities. In most pre-electric societies, women were responsible for maintaining oil lamps, making candles, managing fuel supplies, and organizing evening household activities. This wasn't just domestic drudgery, it was a form of technical expertise that required significant skill and knowledge. Women had to understand different types of fuels, wick materials, lamp maintenance, fire safety, and resource budgeting. A household's evening comfort and productivity depended largely on the woman's skill in managing lighting resources. Women also played crucial roles in organizing evening social activities. They'd coordinate shared lighting arrangements with neighbors, plan seasonal celebrations, manage children's evening routines, and maintain the oral traditions that were passed down during evening gatherings. In many cultures, certain types of evening work were specifically women's domain. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, sewing, and other textile work could be done by lamplight, and were often social activities where women would gather to work together while sharing news, stories, and songs. The phrase, burning the midnight oil, actually comes from women's evening work routines. Women would often stay up late working on textile projects, using precious oil or candles to extend their productive hours. This work was economically important for household survival, but it also created social networks and cultural traditions that were central to community life. But women's relationship with evening lighting wasn't just about work. In many cultures, women were the keepers of evening entertainment traditions. They'd organize storytelling sessions, teach children songs and games, and maintain the cultural practices that made long, dark evenings bearable and meaningful. Women also had to navigate the safety challenges of evening activities. In communities where evening social gatherings were common, women had to balance participation in community life with the very real dangers of moving through dark streets or rural areas. This led to the development of complex social protocols around women's evening activities, who could escort them, which activities were appropriate, and how to balance social participation with personal safety. The economic aspects of lighting were also often managed by women. They'd budget household resources to balance lighting needs with other necessities, negotiate with suppliers for oil and candles, and develop strategies for extending the life of expensive lighting materials. Some women became specialists in lighting technology. They'd make candles for sale, maintain oil lamps for wealthy households, or provide lighting services for special events. These weren't just side businesses, they were legitimate trades that required significant skill and could provide important income for families. Let's also explore the religious and spiritual dimensions of evening lighting, because artificial light wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic and spiritually significant in most cultures. In Christianity, light was associated with divine presence, spiritual truth, and protection from evil. Churches maintained altar candles and oil lamps, not just for practical illumination, but as symbols of God's eternal presence. Evening prayers were often conducted by candlelight, creating an atmosphere of reverence and spiritual focus. The practice of lighting votive candles, small candles lit as offerings or prayers, created a continuous cycle of light in churches and shrines. People would light candles for deceased relatives, for protection during dangerous times, or as expressions of gratitude. These individual flames combined to create a collective illumination that was both practical and spiritually meaningful. Monastic communities developed elaborate schedules of night prayers and services that required careful management of lighting resources. Monks would wake multiple times during the night for prayer services, using oil lamps and candles to illuminate their prayer books and create the proper atmosphere for worship. The symbolism of light conquering darkness was central to Christian theology and practice. Christmas celebrations, Easter vigils, and other major religious observances used dramatic lighting displays to represent spiritual themes. These weren't just decorative, they were theological statements expressed through the manipulation of light and darkness. In Islamic culture, the tradition of night prayers and Ramadan observances created their own patterns of evening lighting. Mosques would maintain oil lamps for night prayers, and during Ramadan, the pre-dawn meal required household lighting at unusual hours. Islamic scholars also developed a rich tradition of evening study and writing, which drove innovation in lighting technology. The need to read and copy texts by lamplight led to improvements in lamp design, fuel quality, and reading techniques that were later adopted by other cultures. In Jewish tradition, the Sabbath candles, Hanukkah lights, and other ritual lighting practices created weekly and seasonal rhythms of illumination that were both religious and practical. The Sabbath evening meal by candlelight wasn't just a religious observance, it was a weekly celebration that brought families together and created a special atmosphere that distinguished sacred time from ordinary time. Buddhist and Hindu traditions also incorporated artificial lighting into religious practice. Temple oil lamps, festival lighting displays, and meditation practices that used flame as a focus for contemplation all contributed to the spiritual significance of artificial light. But the spiritual dimension of lighting wasn't limited to organized religion. Folk traditions, seasonal celebrations, and community rituals often centered around the symbolic power of light conquering darkness. Bonfires, lantern festivals, and other lighting celebrations were ways for communities to assert human agency against the natural cycle of darkness. These celebrations also served practical purposes. They brought communities together during the darkest times of year, provided opportunities for resource sharing, and created social bonds that helped people survive the psychological challenges of extended darkness. The fear of darkness was also a powerful cultural force. In most pre-electric societies, darkness was associated with danger, evil spirits, criminal activity, and death. Artificial lighting wasn't just about practical illumination. It was about creating safe spaces where human civilization could continue despite the threatening darkness outside. This is why so many folk tales and legends feature lights as protection against supernatural threats. The idea that evil spirits couldn't cross thresholds marked by light, or that certain types of flames could ward off supernatural danger, reflected the very real psychological comfort that artificial lighting provided in a world where darkness meant vulnerability. But let's get into some of the more practical and mundane aspects of evening life that movies and books rarely show us. What did people actually eat for dinner when they had to prepare food by lamplight? How did they handle basic hygiene and bathroom needs in the dark? What about medical emergencies that happened at night? Food preparation in low light conditions required different techniques and menu planning than daytime cooking. Many evening meals were simple, one-pot dishes that could be prepared and eaten with minimal lighting. Stews, porridges, bread, and preserved foods were common because they didn't require precise visual monitoring during preparation. Families often prepared evening meals during daylight hours and then reheated them after dark. This saved on fuel costs and reduced the fire hazards associated with extensive cooking by lamplight. Cold meals, bread, cheese, preserved meats, dried fruits were also common for evening consumption. Eating by lamplight or candlelight was a skill that required practice. You had to position your light source to illuminate your food without creating shadows or dripping wax onto your meal. Table manners were adapted to low light conditions, simpler utensils, less elaborate food presentation, and more emphasis on foods that could be eaten safely without precise visual coordination. Hygiene and sanitation in the evening presented unique challenges. Most people used chamber pots or outdoor latrines, which required navigation in darkness. Wealthy households might have servants to assist with these needs, but most people had to manage on their own. Personal hygiene routines were simplified for evening hours. Elaborate washing and grooming were typically done during daylight hours. Evening hygiene focused on basic cleanliness and preparation for sleep. Medical emergencies at night were particularly challenging. Physicians and midwives had to work by whatever artificial lighting was available, which made diagnosis and treatment more difficult and dangerous. Many medical procedures were postponed until daylight hours unless they were absolutely urgent. Childbirth, which could happen at any hour, required careful preparation of lighting supplies. Midwives would bring their own oil lamps and candles, and families would gather all available lighting resources to assist with delivery. The phrase, "burning the candle at both ends," may have originated from the practice of using multiple candles simultaneously during medical emergencies. Home accidents were more common in low light conditions. Burns from oil lamps and candles, cuts from sharp objects that weren't clearly visible, and falls in dark areas were regular hazards. Most households developed safety routines and protocols to minimize these risks. Fire safety was a constant concern. House fires were devastating and often fatal, and they were much more likely to occur during evening hours when multiple flame sources were in use. Families had to balance their need for light against the very real risk of burning down their homes. Many communities developed fighting systems that could operate in darkness. Volunteer fire brigades, community water supplies, and emergency lighting protocols were essential infrastructure for evening safety. Now let's talk about seasonal work patterns and how they were affected by lighting limitations. Different trades and occupations had to adapt their schedules and techniques to work within the constraints of available light. Farmers faced unique challenges during harvest seasons when work needed to continue into evening hours. They'd use torches and lanterns for essential tasks like bringing in crops before bad weather. But most agricultural work was strictly limited to daylight hours. Some farming communities developed cooperative systems where multiple families would pool their lighting resources to extend working hours during critical periods. Barn raising, harvest parties, and other community work events often included shared lighting arrangements that allowed work to continue after sunset. Craftsmen and artisans had to adapt their techniques for low light conditions. Fine detail work was generally done during daylight hours, while evening work focused on tasks that required less precise vision. Blacksmiths, who worked with their own fire-based lighting, were among the few craftsmen who could maintain productivity during evening hours. Textile workers, weavers, spinners, seamstresses developed techniques for working by lamplight, but the quality and complexity of their work was often reduced in low light conditions. Simple, repetitive tasks could be done by feel and memory, while complex patterns and fine stitching required daylight. Merchants and traders had to plan their schedules around lighting limitations. Market hours were determined by available daylight, and long-distance travel required careful coordination with moon phases and weather conditions. But some occupations actually benefited from darkness. Night soil collectors, as mentioned earlier, preferred to work under cover of darkness for obvious reasons. Certain types of hunting and fishing were more effective at night. And some forms of entertainment, storytelling, music, intimate social gatherings were actually enhanced by the atmospheric qualities of lamplight and candlelight. The development of time-keeping systems was also influenced by lighting limitations. Before mechanical clocks became common, people used various methods to track time during dark hours: candle clocks that burned for specific durations, oil lamps with measured fuel supplies, and observation of star positions. Night watchmen developed elaborate systems for calling out the hours and maintaining community awareness of time passage during darkness. The familiar 2 o'clock and all is well wasn't just a security announcement, it was a public time-keeping service. Religious communities often maintained the most sophisticated time-keeping systems, with multiple prayer services throughout the night requiring precise scheduling. Monastic communities developed water clocks, candle clocks, and other devices that could track time accurately in dark conditions. let's also explore the psychological and social aspects of extended evening gatherings. When families and communities spent long hours together in small, dimly lit spaces, it created unique forms of social interaction and cultural development. Extended family conversations by lamplight were where much of the oral tradition was maintained and transmitted. Children learned family history, cultural values, and practical knowledge through these evening sessions. The intimate, focused atmosphere created by limited lighting made these conversations more memorable and meaningful than casual daytime interactions. Conflict resolution often took place during evening gatherings when families and community members were brought together in close proximity. The combination of shared lighting costs and intimate atmosphere encouraged people to work through disagreements rather than avoid each other. But the same conditions could also intensify conflicts. When people were forced to spend long hours together in cramped, dimly lit spaces, personality conflicts and family tensions could escalate quickly. Many communities developed social protocols and conflict resolution mechanisms specifically designed to manage the stresses of extended evening togetherness. The development of games, puzzles, and other entertainment forms was heavily influenced by lighting limitations. Card games, dice games, and board games that could be played by lamplight became popular forms of evening entertainment. Storytelling, riddles, and word games that didn't require visual elements flourished in low light conditions. Music and singing were particularly important forms of evening entertainment because they didn't require good lighting and could involve multiple people simultaneously. Many traditional songs, ballads, and musical styles developed specifically as evening entertainment for communities gathered around limited light sources. The intimate atmosphere created by lamplight also influenced romantic and sexual customs. Courtship rituals, marriage customs, and family planning practices were all adapted to the realities of shared, dimly lit living spaces. Privacy was a luxury that most people couldn't afford, so communities developed elaborate social codes and etiquette systems to manage intimate relationships within the constraints of communal evening life. The phrase, "turn a blind eye," may have originated from the practice of politely ignoring private activities that were impossible to completely conceal in shared living spaces. Now let's examine how different age groups experienced evening life in the pre-electric era. Children's evening routines were heavily structured around safety and education. Parents had to balance children's need for evening social interaction and learning with the very real dangers of open flames and dark spaces. Children learned to move safely in low light conditions from an early age. They developed skills in navigating familiar spaces by memory and touch, understanding fire safety, and contributing to household lighting management. These weren't just practical skills, they were essential survival abilities. Evening education for children often took the form of storytelling, songs, and oral instruction that could be delivered in low light conditions. Many traditional children's stories, nursery rhymes, and educational songs were specifically designed to be shared during evening family gatherings. Children also learned practical skills during evening hours, simple crafts, food preparation, household maintenance tasks that could be done by lamplight. This was often their primary education in practical life skills. But children's evening activities were also carefully supervised due to safety concerns. Open flames, dark spaces, and limited visibility created numerous hazards that required constant adult oversight. For teenagers and young adults, evening hours provided some of the few opportunities for social interaction outside immediate family supervision. Carefully chaperoned evening gatherings, community celebrations, and religious activities allowed young people to meet potential marriage partners and develop social skills. The transition from childhood to adulthood was often marked by increased responsibility for household lighting management and evening safety. Young people learned to maintain oil lamps, manage candles, and take responsibility for fire safety as part of their preparation for independent adult life. Adults bore the primary responsibility for managing household evening activities. They had to balance resource allocation, safety concerns, work productivity, and family social needs within the constraints of limited and expensive artificial lighting. Adult evening activities often centered around essential household tasks that couldn't be completed during daylight hours. Account keeping, planning, equipment maintenance, and other management tasks were often done by lamplight after the day's primary work was finished. But adults also needed social interaction and entertainment to maintain psychological health during long, dark evenings. Adult social gatherings, community meetings, and religious activities provided essential outlets for social connection and mental stimulation. For elderly people, evening hours could be particularly challenging. Reduced vision made navigation in low light conditions more dangerous, and physical limitations made it harder to manage lighting equipment safely. But elderly people also played crucial roles in evening community life. They were often the keepers of oral traditions, the sources of historical knowledge, and the leaders of evening entertainment activities. Their experience and wisdom were particularly valued during the long, contemplative hours of evening gatherings. Many communities developed specific support systems for elderly people during evening hours: assistance with lighting management, help with navigation in dark spaces, and inclusion in community evening activities to prevent isolation and depression. The economic aspects of evening life were complex and varied significantly based on social class, geographic location, and historical period. For most people, artificial lighting represented a significant household expense that required careful budgeting and resource management. Lighting costs could consume 10–20% of a household's total budget, making it one of the major expenses along with food, shelter, and clothing. Families had to make difficult decisions about when and how to use artificial lighting, balancing immediate needs against long-term resource conservation. The lighting economy also created numerous business opportunities. Candle makers, oil suppliers, lamp manufacturers, and lighting equipment merchants all served essential roles in the pre-electric economy. These weren't just small-scale local businesses. The lighting trade involved international commerce in whale oil, beeswax, specialized lamp designs, and other lighting technologies. Wealthy households employed servants specifically to manage lighting, trimming wicks, cleaning lamps, maintaining candles, and ensuring that lighting was available when and where needed. These positions required specialized knowledge and skills, and experienced lighting servants were valuable employees. Some communities developed shared lighting systems that allowed multiple families to pool resources for better evening illumination. These cooperative arrangements required complex social and economic agreements about cost, sharing, usage schedules, and maintenance responsibilities. The seasonal variation in lighting costs also created economic challenges. Winter months required more artificial lighting, but also often coincided with reduced income from agricultural work. Families had to save resources during summer months to afford winter lighting needs. Regional variations in lighting technology and fuel availability created trade opportunities and economic specialization. Areas with access to whale oil, high-quality beeswax, or superior lamp making materials could export these products to regions with different resource bases. The development of more efficient lighting technologies was driven by economic as well as practical considerations. Innovations that reduced fuel consumption, extended burning time, or improved light output could provide significant economic advantages to both producers and consumers. But the economics of lighting also created social inequalities. The difference between rich and poor wasn't just about having more light, it was about having access to different qualities of light, different types of evening activities, and different levels of safety and comfort during dark hours. These economic disparities influenced social relationships, cultural development, and community structure in ways that extended far beyond simple differences in lighting quality. As we near the end of our journey through the pre-electric night, it's worth reflecting on what we've lost and gained in our transition to electric lighting. The convenience and safety of modern lighting are undeniable benefits, but we've also lost some important aspects of human experience and community life. The rhythm of natural light cycles, the intimate social gatherings necessitated by shared lighting resources, the development of night vision and navigation skills, the appreciation for the precious nature of artificial light. These were all integral parts of human experience for thousands of years. The transition to electric lighting happened remarkably quickly in historical terms. Within a few generations, entire cultures shifted from lighting systems that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia to the instant abundant illumination that we take for granted today. This transition brought enormous benefits, improved safety, increased productivity, better health outcomes, and new forms of entertainment and social interaction. But it also fundamentally changed human relationships with darkness, natural cycles, and community resource sharing. Modern people often experience anxiety and discomfort in truly dark environments that would have been completely normal for our ancestors. We've lost many of the skills and cultural practices that helped previous generations thrive in low light conditions. But we've also gained new forms of evening entertainment, extended productive hours, improved safety and security, and freedom from the constant fire hazards and resource limitations that constrained pre-electric evening life. The story of how humans learned to extend their days beyond sunset is ultimately a story of ingenuity, adaptation, and community cooperation. From the first oil lamps to elaborate candle-making industries, from seasonal lighting festivals to cooperative resource sharing systems, our ancestors developed remarkable solutions to the challenges of darkness. These solutions weren't just technological, they were social, cultural, and economic innovations that shaped the development of human civilization. The evening gatherings that shared lighting costs also shared knowledge, culture, and social bonds. The seasonal rhythms imposed by lighting limitations created cultural traditions that persist today. The economic systems that developed around lighting trade contributed to the growth of commerce and international exchange. Understanding how people lived and thrived in the pre-electric night gives us a deeper appreciation for both the ingenuity of our ancestors and the remarkable transformation that electric lighting brought to human life. It also provides perspective on our current relationship with technology, community, and the natural world. The next time you flip a light switch or charge your phone, take a moment to imagine what your evening would be like with just a single candle or oil lamp. Think about how you'd organize your activities, manage your resources, and connect with your family and community within those constraints. The pre-electric night wasn't just a time of darkness to be endured, it was a parallel world of human activity, creativity, and social connection that operated according to different rules and rhythms than our modern evening life. It was a world where light was precious, community was essential, and the boundary between day and night marked a fundamental transition in the rhythm of human existence. And maybe, just maybe, there are some lessons from that world that could enrich our own relationship with evening, community, and the simple, but profound human need to push back against the darkness together. So, the next time you're scrolling through your phone late at night, bathed in the artificial glow of LED screens and electric lighting, remember the countless generations who gathered around flickering flames, sharing stories, songs, and the precious gift of light in the darkness. They found ways not just to survive the long night, but to make it meaningful, productive, and deeply human. That's the real story of life before electric lights, not just the struggle against darkness, but the triumph of human creativity, community, and resilience in creating light, warmth, and connection even in the deepest night. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the pre-electric night. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical daily life, let me know in the comments what other aspects of pre-modern life you'd like to explore. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more of these detailed explorations of how our ancestors lived, worked, and found meaning in worlds so different from our own. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and maybe try spending an evening by candlelight, just to see what you might discover about the rhythm of life before the flip of a switch changed everything.